Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Sunday morning, just getting ready to record Outsiders and the First Moondog. And here we have Rowan of Rin, who seems to want his third breakfast. I don't know whether he'll still be here when the broadcast starts, but I thought I'd share him with you just in case he goes away later.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not.
Yes, and here live via helicopter from many other states of the Commonwealth, gathered are Adam Crichton, economics correspondent, editorial writer, the Australian newspaper, Eric Jensen, editor of the Saturday paper, Jim Middleton, a veteran political journalist, University of Melbourne's new Vice-Chancellor's Fellow. Jim, Fellow.
Fellow indeed, yes.
Well played that man.
How did that happen?
Well, I don't know, but we're now across live to the officer of the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who's whizzing in to join us. No, she's not. We don't have any grabs. Oh, well. Oh, yes, we do.
Shall we dance?
Eric, I think a piece of sound appropriate in so many ways.
Told us more than the press conference did, and certainly it was more repentant.
Well, this is the thing. Repentance was not the long suit, as we saw Bron Bishop facing the media finally yesterday after the $5,000 helicopter flight.
An error of judgment, but within the guidelines. How exactly does that work out?
Guidelines. This is the interesting thing. Adam, what's your take on that? Because she was on a party fundraising business and yet claimed it on the public purse. Is that within guidelines?
Well, look, it probably is, and that's the sad factfulness. I think it is kind of within the guidelines, and this is just one isolated case, albeit a very funny one. I mean, it's the funniest story in weeks. It's a cartoonist dream, this story, but the sad thing is that there is a very grey area between party fundraising and official parliamentary business.
Is it that grey, Eric, or is it particular to the role of the Speaker here gives this a certain amount of greyness?
That adds another dimension because we assume that the Speaker is independent, but of course the Speaker remains a member of her party and remains required by that party to participate in fundraising. Bronwyn Bishop tells us she'll also happily fundraise for the Labor Party or for anyone else who wants her to fundraise because she's such a fine independent Speaker, and I think
the calls are flooding in.
Her parliamentary record speaks for that. I mean, I think she passed the 400th member of Parliament she'd ejected just before the winter break, and I think 393 of them had been Labor members. But that is simply because the coalition is such a well-behaved rabble.
Yes.
The fact of the matter is, it may well be within the guidelines, but her reason for handing the money back is incoherent, to say the least. I mean, she's suggesting that there's an error of judgment within the guidelines. So $5,000, she says, the quantum is too much. Well, what would have been okay? 3,000, 2,500, 1,500? Or why didn't she just use a Comcar?
And then we read today about a trip to Europe where she was campaigning for the European Parliament, for the international parliamentary, whatever that was, that she didn't get the job, but she was there with others. Their on-road costs were significantly less.
Well, they
than
were
hers.
significant. I'm less exercised about this because clearly being a member of the International Parliamentary Union, a democratic institution which brings together the various parliaments from around the world, and having an aspiration to be president or chair of that or whatever is
need to campaign.
Fair enough. That seems to me to be expensive, but not as expensive as getting a seat on the Security Council, but probably not quite in the same area. But nevertheless, that is actually part of the job, or can be assessed at. I do not see how being a Speaker and using, as I understand it, a specific entitlement of the Speaker's office to campaign for funds for a party fits within the sniff test, as Joe Hockey put it earlier in the week, in terms of the Speaker's role.
But this is the problem with the guidelines, is that, if we apply Hockey's inelegantly named sniff test, the guidelines themselves smell. And Bishop, I think, is correct. I'm sure Department of Finance, when they send back their report, will
it'll
agree
be
with
found
her.
to be within the letter of the.
I think that's quite right, yes.
But Adam, here's the thing, isn't it? I mean, the politicians spend so much of their time out there trying to raise money, and we see time and time and time and time again where that's the thing that throws the whole political craft into this grey area of disrepute and questionable conduct.
Yeah, certainly that's true. It's a vicious circle, really. I mean, the support for the two major parties financially amongst the general population has crumbled, and so they need to have more specific fundraising activities than they once did. I mean, for me, the bigger question here with all of this is just the whole cost of the political class itself. I mean, at the end of the day, $5,200 is a very small amount of money. I mean, it's not even a drop in the ocean. It's even smaller than that. I mean, the cost of the members and senators alone is about $100 million a year. That's their salaries and their expenses. I mean, that's less than 250 people we're talking about here, right? It's a lot. And then if you include private staff, right, that's another $230 million a year. This is just the private staff, not the bureaucracy. I mean, it's enormously wasteful and expensive, and there is a huge scope for efficiencies here. And I just hope that from funny stories like this, some sort of reform comes. But of course it won't, right? Because it's in the interest of both sides of parties not to pick on each other in this regard, because there is so many examples.
They are known to pick on each other on occasion in this sort of thing. I mean, not around fundraising, but the conduct of Peter Slipper, for example, Eric, over significantly less money was...
A significant difference there is that Peter Slipper was doing something that could never be defined as operating inside the office. He was driving cabs around Canberra wineries to buy wine. I mean, there's a lot of things that the Speaker might need to do. That is not one of them. And the AFP investigation into Peter Slipper came from the fact that he hadn't paid back that money ahead of the investigation starting. I think the AFP were right to laugh at Labor when Labor suggested that they might investigate Bronwyn Bishop over that. That was kind of a ludicrous overreach. And it's strange in a story like this that you would need to overreach like that. There is so much that is wrong with this story that dragging in...
It is abundant in the simple sum of its own terms. It's no embellishment is really required.
So look, I've got to say, it's not the quantum of what our politicians cost us that cause me particular problems. It's the thicket of regulations and so on that surround what they're entitled to do, what they're not entitled to do, how that works, the involvement of the Department of Finance at a very micromanagerial level, all these sorts of things. For example, as I understand it, members of Parliament have to pay out of their own pocket if they wish to present a plaque, as one MP did in the last week or so, to former serving soldiers within their electorate. That comes out of their own kick. Now, one would have thought that that's something that the public purse could afford to spend money on, to recognise a contribution to the service of the nation. On the other hand, why on earth fundraising for a political party fits within the guidelines is odd. But would it not be better to have fewer regulations and to leave the money at the discretion, to hand the money at the discretion of the member, rather than having these hoops that they have to go through, which create artificial
That's a good idea, I think, Jim.
different areas.
I was going to say that's a very good idea, I think, Jim. I mean, if each MP and senator had some sort of annual cap that they could spend, and then they could kind of carve that up at their own discretion, but couldn't go over a certain limit, or even if, and this is even more extreme, but even if the member themselves had to pay 5 or 10% of the actual cost of all of these expenses, that would give some discipline into the level of excess in expenses.
Where this begins to hit the road, I think, I mean, the sum of parts on this is, yes, interesting enough, and there are issues of probity around it, but where it starts to impinge on the broad reputation of politics and politicians and the political class is, I think, where it starts to have bigger consequences. And that takes us to things like discussions around reform and tax and difficult issues of policy. And we're expecting people with extremely low public reputation and extremely low public trust to then carry these conversations in which great trust is implied. I mean, these things, Eric, are sort of really hard to reconcile. It's where they eat at each other.
They certainly do, and I think that comes also somewhat to the question of election funding and the question of donations. There's, an extraordinary amount of time is spent in a politician's life raising money to try and be elected at the next election. There seem to be only two reasons you give money to a politician. One is that you have great belief in the party and what they stand for, and the other is that you expect some sort of favour in return. I think our politics has done a fair bit to degrade the former, and unfortunately spent a fair bit enhancing the latter. And the larger conversation that could be had about how elections are funded without requiring politicians to go cap in hand looking for donations is also an important aspect of this.
I think the great sadness of the current political environment we find ourselves in is we have two leaders who have so little public standing that in effect weakness has become the new black in politics. That is that the only thing Tony Abbott and Bill Shorten are capable of doing is trying to tear each other down. They have no ability to manoeuvre. They have no political capital to spend. Therefore, the only road to success for either of them is to rip each other down. This means that whatever the best intentions of those attempting to promote a reform agenda have no hope at all, because neither of these standard bearers can lead anymore.
And if you have so little political capital that in announcing a conversation on tax reform, you, in that same sentence, rule out everything that might actually be worth doing in terms of tax reform, you are really not governing.
Here's Joe Hockey talking on that subject.
Surely it's not beyond the capacity of us as a country to have a sensible, mature debate about long-term tax reform more generally.
Yeah, and Crichton, he's right, isn't he? And not only is it, a possibility, it should be a possibility, it's utterly desirable at the moment to have that, and yet here we are, as Eric says, instantly ruling out everything that might form part of that conversation.
Yeah, certainly that's true. Look, I mean, both at the state and the federal level, we have a fairly dysfunctional tax system, I would say, in many areas. But I just don't think that there will be any change. I think the fundamental problem is it's much harder now, quite aside from the so-called 24-hour media cycle, etc. It's much harder to mount a case because the share of the population, the number of households that are getting something from the federal government has gone from about a quarter in the 1960s to about 65% or 2/3. So the sheer number of voters who are willing to vote against anything that will see a reduction in benefits, say, or even a rationalisation of benefits. I mean, there's like 76 different payments out there.
Everybody has skin in the game.
That's right. Everyone's got skin in the game. So it's very, very hard. And of course, as soon as there's a group that's going to lose even $1 a week, the press are all over it. It's front page. Look at this person. They're going to lose $1 a week. And so that's all anyone thinks about. No one thinks about the medium to long-term benefits of a more sensible system. And even the person who's going to lose $1 a week may well end up better off in 4 or 5 years because of the changes in the incentives in the economy. But sadly, we don't seem to be able to have any success in this regard. So
Jim,
I despair.
I was just going to say a couple of things. Number one is that for Joe Hockey to talk about a mature discussion at a point where the government had already ruled out anything to do with taxation weeks and weeks beforehand, I mean, it's an absurd proposition. But the second thing is that the disappointment about leadership should not just be confined to Abbott and Shorten. And let's look at the state premiers, people who have got political capital, people like Daniel Andrews, for example, elected, refusing to entertain any consideration of tax changes which would be to the benefit of their community.
Extremely spineless moment this week.
It was indeed, and contrast that with the one state politician who I think is prepared to have a bit of a dip, and that is Jay Weatherill, surprisingly enough in South Australia. Surprising because he was re-elected, won an election he never should have, if you look at the state of the parties in South Australia at the time leading up to the election, but nevertheless has been prepared to at least discuss reform and change in areas of difficulty. Why isn't that the template anymore for leadership, at least at the state level, even if we can't get it federally?
I mean, I take, Eric, that the point Adam makes there about personal investment in this conversation, and that adding a degree of difficulty, but that still puts the onus to politics to make a case.
This is, at the moment, kind of reform by cowardice. There is personal skin in the game for the $25 billion or so in bracket creep that is expected to be banked over the next 3 years. I think that's in the Ford estimates at a figure somewhere
counting
like that. That is a very cowardly way to reform or to increase revenue from a tax system that says the middle income earners will pay more than anyone else in those kind of reforms by stasis. And hopefully we'll count on that money coming in and not do anything to look at, say, generous super conditions or any of the other genuinely unfair things in our tax system.
Is there hope for this, Adam? I mean, this is all framed in the context here is of need and is of, the necessity of actually coming to grips with this. We do need to have this conversation.
Well, I'm fairly pessimistic, I think. I mean, if Australia, I think, can carry on pretty much not engaging in any reform for a great number of years before there's any sort of crisis. And I think
Here endeth Outsiders Part 1.